Hi, today we're going to be exploring CSS Grid. If you're new enough to web development and you want to get a website up and running quickly, then Grid might be a really great option. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. We're going to start with a totally blank page and we're going to use only HTML and CSS to design this website layout. As you can see, we have 5 main elements, and when you resize the website down to a smaller screen size, the sidebar is going to disappear, and then when you bring it bigger again, the sidebar will pop back up. So once you get a handle on the main concepts and methods of Grid, you really can do an awful lot very quickly, and you can create responsive and engaging layouts, and it becomes very easy to do so. So to get started, open up whatever text editor you use. And actually, before we start, I just want to say a lot of this tutorial is going to be a bit of a yawn fest if you're already up to speed with Grid. I'm going to walk you through every single step of the way to creating the layout that we saw. So if you're not into watching me code a ton of HTML elements, adding the classes to them, etc., please feel free to skip ahead. I won't be too insulted. So anyway, to get started, as I said, we're going to start from a totally blank page. I'm just going to write in quickly the doc type and other such things that need to be there. So HTML, and then we want a HTML tag, and we need a language, which is going to be English, and we need a direction, which is going to be left to right. Okay, and then we're just gonna connect up to a CSS file that I have already created. You can see there, it's just a blank file that's called grid.css. So we want to link to that, and we're going to give it a relationship of style sheet. And the href is just going to be a relative link grid.css, which is what it's called. Okay, and we'll just close that head tag. Now, and we may as well actually just, for the fun, throw in a title, and we'll call it CSS Grid Tutorial. So we're going to start by adding some structure to the HTML. We're just going to close the HTML tag, and we're going to add a couple of body tags, and we're going to write everything in between them. So for the written version of this, I did not use the HTML5 semantic elements, which you really should be using because it adds a level of specificity, it adds definition to your HTML5 code. So we'll start with the header, which we're going to put in as header. That is followed by a navbar, nav, followed by a sidebar, which is an aside, which is followed by the main content, which we'll put in as main, and finally we need a footer. Right, so within each of these elements, I'm going to give them 2 classes. The first class is going to refer to them specifically, and the second class is just going to be section. And section is going to allow me to apply rules to every one of the elements with one go. So this one is going to be navbar and section. This is going to be sidebar and section. Main is going to have a class of main-content and section, and the footer will get a class of footer and section. Right, so now within each of these elements, I'm going to nest h4 tags with the name of what they are, and that's just so it pops up on the layout, so you see header written within the header element. So that's going to be header, and the next one is going to say navbar, and the next one is going to say sidebar. Feel free to skip forward as I'm doing this, or code along, whatever you prefer. This one will be main content, and this guy is going to be footer. Great. So we're almost done with our structure. That's basically the page written out. And the final thing we're going to do before we go and start applying some styles in the CSS is we're going to wrap all of this in a div whose only purpose is to act as the grid container. So we're going to give that div a class of grid container to illustrate that point, and div. So that's basically your first thing. That's the HTML done. Oh, and actually I've forgotten to close this div here. So now that's the HTML done. So we can actually look and see what that looks like so far. Just go over to our browser and just refresh. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's what it looks like. So it's 1991 all over again. So obviously we need to go in now and apply some styles to make that not look like that. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we'll just minimize this and we'll go across to grid.css and we're going to add some styles. So we'll go into grid container first and we're just going to give that a display of grid. So that's what defines it as a grid. That's what makes this a grid. We're going to give that a background color of light gray, just so we can see where it is. And we're going to give it a minimum height of, let's say, 600 pixels. We're going to give it a maximum width of 100%. Okay, so that's it for the grid container for the time being. We'll go down now, we're going to style a section class, which of course, as you know, applies to all the elements equally. So we'll put a border radius of about 5 pixels. It's just going to round the corners of each of the elements. It's going to look quite nice. And we'll have a padding of 15 pixels. And we're going to give it any other styles? No. What we'll do actually is that we will apply styles to the H4 specifically. So we'll do section H4. And so for the H4 elements, we're going to apply a color of white. We're going to say font family sans serif, because I do not like serifs. And we're going to give it a font size of, let's say, 1.2M. And may as well just give that another padding, say 20 pixels, see what that looks like. Okay, so that's for the section. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through each element and we're going to give them a background color. So we'll start with the header and we'll give that a background color of, say, light sea green. Now I'm just going to give these CSS background colors, but if you want to change, it doesn't really matter what color they are. So a navbar, I'll give it a background color of navy. And then we'll do the sidebar, give that a background color of light sky blue. Light sky blue. And the main content, I think we're just going to have space. Main content, give that a background color of turquoise. Finally, the footer. Give that a background color of deep sky blue. Okay, so we have some styles applied to all of them now. We haven't really gone into great depth with the grid yet. We've applied a display grid to the grid container, so technically it is a grid. Okay, so let's go over to the browser and see what we have so far. So as you can see, this is a minimum height of 600 pixels. So if we make it smaller, it doesn't go smaller than 600 pixels, but it's a max width of 100. So that is fully responsive there. It goes in and out. These are all the different div elements. These are the H4s. And as you can see, they're different background colors. So what we need to do now is go back to the CSS and add a few more styles to the grid container itself. Okay, so what we need to do now is we want to go back into the CSS and we're going to define exactly what we want our grid container to look like. So exactly what we want the columns and the rows to look like. And we're going to do that with grid template columns and grid template rows, but we'll start with columns. So first thing I'm going to use is an FR, which is a fractional unit, and it basically divides up the space. So I'm going to say I want 4 equally spaced columns in which to work and in which to lay out the elements. So, well, how do I do that? I can write 1FR, that's the first column, 1FR, second column, etc. So that is 4 equally spaced columns, but there is an easier way to do that. So I'm just going to delete those. I'll use this keyword, which is repeat, and then brackets, and I'm going to say I want to repeat 4 columns, comma, and I want them to be 1 fractional unit each. And a fractional unit, like I said, just divides up the space. So there are columns. We have 4 equal columns. And we go to grid template rows. Now this is going to be slightly different. Now obviously I've already worked out these ratios in advance, but when you're doing your own layout, the best way to do it is obviously to sketch out a layout in advance. So sketch out a wireframe or whatever and decide how many rows and how many columns you will need to best be able to stretch your elements on the screen depending on how responsive you want it, etc. So this is just what works for this layout. So I've decided on the first row being 4FR, right? The second row, I'm going to give it an absolute value of 40 pixels. Now the second row is going to be the nav bar, which is going to be thin. The third row is going to represent most of the main content is going to be in there. So I'm going to make it a third bigger than the header. So it's going to be 6FR. And then the last row is going to be a third of the main content. So it's going to be 2FR. Okay, so let's see what that looks like now. If we go over to our browser, we can see that these are the 4 equally spaced columns, and the 5th element has been pushed to the next row, which is the thin navbar row. What we haven't done is we haven't defined where we want our elements to sit within those rules that we just laid out. So we've said we want 4 equally spaced columns, we want a certain amount of rows, we want them to be this wide, but we haven't said where we want our elements to sit. So that's what we do now. Okay, so before we go back into the CSS, I'm going to show you a really, really cool tool that this particular browser has, and it's Firefox Nightly that I'm using. So if you do on a Mac, control click, or on a PC, right click, and you click on Inspect Element, it'll bring you into the Firefox Nightly Dev Tools. And then if you make sure that you have your grid container selected and then go across to where you can see grid or here and just click on grid, it'll then show you the grid lines that you've defined yourself. So as you can see here, this thin one here is the 40 pixel. This first one is the 4FR, 6FR, 1FR. So you can actually see, and then our equal columns go across. So it really helps you visualize the grids that you've created. And actually, if you go down here across in grid display settings and click on display line numbers, it's even more useful. So these numbers are your grid lines. And this is what we're going to use now to explicitly set where you want your various elements to live in the grid container. So we're going to start with the header, and we want our header to start here as the first column, and it's 1, and we want it to span all of these columns right to 5. So we're going to say we want it to start at 1 and we want it to finish at 5. Except we're not going to use 5. What we're going to use is, if you can see down here just under the scroll bar, there's a -1 and a -1 at the bottom. And this -1 just means you want it to go all the way to the end of the grid column, which is very useful if you then go back and say you want to add some columns or you want to change it a little bit. It'll mean that the header will always span the full width of the page and you won't have to reset the specific header rule. So that's how we're going to do the header. So let's go back and I'm going to set that and then show you what happens. So we'll go into the header and we're going to use grid column start. And we're just going to say 1. So that's the first rule. And then grid column end. And we're going to say -1, like I said. So it spans the full width. Then we go down and we're going to say grid row start. 1 again, and we want it to go to grid row end 2. We just want it to take up the first row. So that's the header rule. So let's go back over and see what that's done. So we'll just refresh the page. Voila. So we have our header and that's set exactly as we want it. And if you go in and out, you can see it's fully responsive. So the next one is the nav bar. So let's switch over and define our nav bar rules. We go in here, and actually this time I'm going to do a shortcut. Instead of writing grid column start and grid column end, I'm just going to write grid column. And then the first number here is the start number. So that's going to be the same, 1. And the last number is the end number, which again, like the header, is going to span the full width of the page. So it's going to be -1. And then we go down and we'll do grid row, and same exact thing. First number is the first row. So the grid row that it starts on is going to be 2 because the header came down to the second line, and it's going to span 1 row, so until 3. And then we can switch over and see what we've done here. And as you can see, the header is set, the navbar is set. Now the navbar H4 has disappeared, and that's because of padding and other reasons, but we'll fix that later. So now I'm going to just go through and set the rest of where I want these to live. Now the sidebar is actually taking up exactly where it should be, but it hasn't been set explicitly, so we're going to do that now. So as you can see, we want our sidebar to go from the first column to the second column. So let's do that here. So we go in here and we'll just say grid column 1, 2, 2. And then grid row, that's going to be 3 to 4. And we'll just check that that's correct. So I'll just refresh the page, and it hasn't changed obviously, but it is right. So then main content, we're going to say grid column. It's going to be from 2 to -1. So we want it to span the full width from the second column. And grid row, the main content is going to go from, again, 3 to 4. And then finally, we have the footer. So grid column is going to be 1 to -1, same as the header. And grid row, it's going to be 4. And this time we're going to use -1 on the row to -1. Okay, so let's go see what that looks like. Right, and the main thing I've noticed here is that I actually want to constrain my height to 600 pixels. So I'm going to go back and change that rule. So here where it says minimum height, I'm going to take out minimum and save it and have a look there. And that's much better. Now the second thing is I'm going to show you how to do row gaps and column gaps, which is basically the CSS grid way of doing margins and padding, well, margins specifically between columns and rows. So we can just write row gap, and just to show you, I'll do a row gap of 5 pixels. I'm going to do a column gap of 20 pixels. And let's see what that looks like now. So you can see the column gap 20 pixels, row gap of 5 pixels. Now, if you don't want to set these separately, if you want them all to be the same, you can actually just delete these, and we'll just write gap 10 pixels, and that will set the row gap and the column gaps both for 10 pixels. Let's go back, refresh, there we go. So that's a really simple way of putting gutter space between your columns and your rows. Now, the next thing I want to do is, as you can tell, as you can see, navbar has completely disappeared, and we want to be able to see navbar. And not only that, we'd like to center it, and we'd like to center each of these H4 divs in their containers. Now, the fastest way to do that, or the best way to do that in this case, is I'm going to turn each of those elements into a grid container itself by applying a display grid to the section class, which will turn each one of those into a grid. And then I'm going to apply align content to center, and that is going to center those H4s vertically in their containers, which I will show you now just before we change. See, so then navbar has come back. So this has centered these H4s vertically by applying an align content to the grid container itself. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do another rule, which is justify content, also center, and that is going to center them horizontally, which if we go across now, there we see it, it's centered them horizontally and vertically in their containers, which is a super simple rule, but really, really useful. So what we're going to do now is we're going to write some rules that removes the sidebar on smaller screen sizes. And we're going to kind of apply a mobile first approach, even though we didn't design this mobile first, but it is considered best practice to write your code mobile first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add down the bottom here, I'm going to add a media query that targets screens over 768 pixels. So we'll say min width 768 pixels. So anything that's going to be put in this media query is going to apply to larger screens. And that's how we're going to pretend that we've done this mobile first, but it wasn't. So we'll start by looking at the grid template columns, because on the smaller screens, since we're taking away the sidebar, we're not going to need 4 columns anymore. So we'll just copy this rule and we'll change the 4 on smaller screens to 3. And we'll just go in here and we'll write grid container class again. And we'll just paste in the rule for the larger screens just there. So on small screens now we only have 3 equally sized columns. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the sidebar on small screens. So this rule here that says sidebar, we're just going to copy all of that And we're just actually going to cut it from that rule. And here, instead of sidebar, where it says sidebar, we're just going to write display none. And down here, we'll write sidebar, and we'll just paste in what we just copied. And actually just, we'll write in display grid to make sure it pops up. So that's the sidebar taken away on the small screens and put in. And then the final thing we need to change is the main content. Now the main content currently runs from 2 to -1, but we don't want that on small screens now. We want it to start at the beginning. So we'll change that from 1 to -1, and we'll just copy grid column. And down here, we'll write main content and paste that in and change it back to 2 to -1. So that's the large screen definition there. And I think that looks about right. So let's just check in the browser and make sure this is acting as we expect it to. So this is how it was on large screens, and it should stay that way. So large screens, we have a sidebar and a main content, but now when we resize it down to under 768 pixels, as you can see, the sidebar disappears and the main content takes up that space. So that's exactly what we want. And you can see how easy that was to do just by changing a few of the grid container rules. So incredibly flexible for using with media queries and for responsive websites. Right, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add a few more elements into the main content section. So we'll just switch over to grid.html. We'll get h4 main content. We'll just create a little bit of space there. So we're going to add 2 sections and a figure. So we'll add the first section. We'll give it a class of section 1. And we'll just add something like, here's some info on something. And we'll close that section out. Then we'll add a figure. And we'll put an image inside that figure. We'll give it a class of happy, and we'll give it a source of happy.png, which you can see in the left-hand corner. And then inside that figure, the reason we're using figure is to show the various effects of nested elements. So we'll actually write in a fig caption, which is another HTML5 semantic element. And we'll just give that fig caption fig1 happy. And we'll close out that fig caption, and then we'll close out that figure. Okay, and we'll finish up with one more section, give it a class of section 2, and we'll just write, here's some more info about something else. And we'll close out that section. Okay, so we have basically just nested some more elements inside the main content grid container. Because if you remember, we actually made every section a grid container to center up the H4. So this is already a grid container. So we have a H4, a section, a figure, and another section, and they're all direct children of that grid container. And then inside the figure, that figure has its own children, which will not be directly affected by rules that we apply to that grid container, but we'll see how that works now in a second. So what we'll do now is we will just save that out, and we'll go into our browser and we'll see what we've done. Right, so the happy image is far too big, so we'll just go over to the CSS quickly just to sort that out. So we'll go here and we'll write image.happy, and we'll just say, let's see, we'll give it a max width of 60 pixels and a max height of 60 pixels, and we'll save that out and just make sure that has fixed the problem, and it has. And there you can see everything is just lined up in the order that we've written it in to the HTML. So what we want to do now is I'm going to create some columns and some rows within the main content. So I'm going to do 3 columns, 2 rows, and then we're going to line up the various elements in an order that we want. So I want the main content to be on the H4 main content to be on the first row, and then I want section 1 to be on I want all of these sections and figures to be on the second row, section 1 first, then the figure in the middle, and then section 2 last. Right, so we'll just switch over to the CSS again, and in the main content area, we'll just write in those columns and rows that we want. So we'll write grid template columns, and we're just going to do it pedantically like that, 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. We could use repeat, but it's only 3. And then grid template rows, we'll do the same, 1FR, 1FR. So we've set up 3 rows and 3 columns and 2 rows. And so we'll switch over to the browser and we'll see what effect that has had. And as you can see, it has taken the elements in order and just placed them in the rows. And if we go into inspect element and click on main content grid, we can actually see exactly what it's done. We'll just turn on the line numbers as well because they're useful. And you can see the subgrid that it's created and where it's positioned each of the elements. So what we want to do now is we want to explicitly tell grid where we want each of our elements. And we'll start with the H4. So under main content there, we'll just write main content H4. And we'll write in grid column, and we know we want it to go from 2 to 3, and then we'll write in grid row, and that's from 1 to 2. And can just check that that's doing what we want it to do, and there it is. So we'll go back over and we'll do the same to the rest of the elements. So we'll start then with, let's say, section 1, because that's the next one in order. And we want that on the second column, or sorry, the first column, the second row. So we'll do grid column, and we'll say we want it from 1 to 2. And grid row, we want it from 2 to 3. And then we'll go down and we'll do section 2. And that's going to be on the other side of the figure. So for section 2, grid column, we know that we want it from 3, and we'll say to -1. And then grid row is the same as the top one. So we'll say 2 to 3. And now we'll apply some constraints to where we want figure to go. And for figure, we want it to be on the bottom row in the middle column. So grid column, again, 2 to 3, and grid row, 2 to 3. So let's save that and make sure that everything is doing what we want. And there we have it. So we have the main content, the figure in the middle, section 1, section 2. Now the only thing left to do is to center all of those elements in their respective rows and columns. Right, so we'll just switch back over to the CSS and we will apply a rule to the main content div. So on the main content grid container, if we write justify items center, that'll center the children vertically. So we'll switch over to Firefox and we'll just refresh the page, and there you can see it's centered those elements vertically. And now we need to center them horizontally, and to do that we'll go back into the CSS and we'll apply align self to the actual sections themselves. So if we go down to main content H4 and we write align self center, save that, and we'll go to section 1, align self center, save that, section 2, align self center, and figure, align self center. Now if we save that, we'll go back and refresh the page, and you can see they've centered all their divs. So everything is centered within its own column and row. The only exception to that, of course, is the fig caption and the image. The fig caption is slightly off center, and that's because it isn't, the rules that you apply to the grid container aren't affecting these, the fig caption or the image, because they are not direct children of that grid container. So to do that, we could do one of two things. We could make the figure itself a grid container and then do the same thing. But in this case, I'm just going to show you just very briefly how to use flex within a grid container. So we're actually going to go to the figure and we're going to apply display flex to the figure itself. So we'll go across now and I'll show you what that has done. We'll refresh the page. Now the default is to do flex direction rows. So we're going to change that to bring the bring the fig caption back under the figure. We'll just change the flex direction here to column. Save that out and have a look again, refresh, and then we're back to normal. And then the last thing we need to do in order to line them up properly is just to write align items on the fig center. Save that, and we'll go back to Firefox and refresh, and then we've centered those beautifully. So everything is centered up, everything is responsive. We open and close, the sidebar disappears, everything stays centered. So that's it. We've used grid, a tiny bit of flex at the end to create a fully responsive website layout. And as you can see, the possibilities really are endless when you can nest grids inside other grids and then nest flexbox inside grids, etc. And I really love using CSS Grid, and I'm very excited to create more content to showcase some of the more advanced layouts you can accomplish with this super useful tool. So I hope this tutorial was useful, and if you've enjoyed it and want to see more walkthroughs and code alongs, please subscribe below. Thanks very much.